I don't want to get shadow banned by YouTube, so I have to speak very carefully for the first minute of this video. I'm angry about all the AI slop videos that have came out recently about the topic I'm going to be talking about. There's quite a bit of information that they get wrong, and as I am a human with lived experience in the matter, and I would consider myself a survivor of that experience, I think it's fair that I get a say in the matter and get a chance to say my side of the story, because the AI videos about the subject are just repeating whatever information they can get a hold of, whether it be entirely correct or not, and just spitting it back out for shock or entertainment value, which I don't think is very fair. It's a horrifying subject, and it's a debilitating subject that has ruined lives. It's outright caused people to no longer be with us. More than a handful, and I think that's terrifying. It's a class of chemical that was so unpredictable that each use of it was something similar to a game of Russian roulette. And that's not hyperbole, that's true. I mean, every time that I personally used it, that was, again, just a pull of the trigger, a chance at potential disaster, lifetime disablement, or potentially even death. As I said before, I would consider myself a survivor of this class of chemical, and considering I've been abstinent from them for nearly 9 years now, after being reliant on them for multiple years, it's had a noticeable effect both physically and mentally to this day on my person. That said, I still have a mix of positive and negative things to say about the subject. Firstly, let me get some disclaimers out of the way. If you're suffering with active addiction, please reach out to someone close to you or a medical professional, if possible. If you don't have anyone to talk to, you can leave a comment. I'm not a professional, but I'm willing to listen to you. If you aren't already using synthetic cannabinoids, then do not start using them. Physical withdrawal symptoms can appear within just a week or so of active use, and I'll get into that later, but trust me, you don't want to go through that experience. So, the government doesn't like THC. We all know that. I don't even really need to source anything for that. That's just, if you live in America, you understand the government has a complicated history with cannabis products and THC as a chemical. THC is the main psychoactive component of cannabis. There were a multitude of laws put in place in the early 20th century that made Delta-9 THC Schedule 1, and because the government decided that there was no medical or scientific purpose for the plant of cannabis as it was, and the chemical Delta-9 THC, that meant that researchers couldn't use it to study its effects on the human body, its effect on mammal studies and whatnot. So that created a problem. Scientists need to study the way the human body functions, and THC was a good way at stimulating something that would become known as the cannabinoid receptors. In the 80s, we discovered the CB1 receptors from in vitro studies. Cells in a petri dish were able to show us that the human brain actually evolved and developed a way to process THC and other phytocannabinoids. We actually have a pathway in our body meant to process and use cannabis as a substance, compared to most other drugs, which are just chemicals flipping a switch or so in your brain, just sending certain signals. CB1 and CB2 receptors operate a little bit differently. In the 90s, we discovered the CB2 receptor. We discovered that there are multiple pathways in which the human body and brain can operate and process cannabinoids and other phytocannabinoids. But with the prohibition on Delta-9 THC and, without being able to properly study using Delta-9 THC, we needed some other form of drug that could mimic and, excite the CB1, CB2 receptors without falling astray of the laws of the government by using a Schedule 1 substance. So we needed to synthesize cannabinoids. And that was where the first wave of synthetic cannabinoids came to be, were for scientific study. Cannabinoids such as CP-55940 were one of the very first, and was a very crucial component in discovering the cannabinoid receptors in the early 90s in the human brain. It's not to say that there was only scientific purposes for these early synthetic cannabinoids, because that's not true. We were using some of the earlier synthetic cannabinoids that we produced in the 80s and 90s for medical reasons. So some of the early THC analogs we were using as antiemetics, so, a tool to combat nausea and vomiting, such as nabilone in 1981 and marinol and dronabinol in 1985. So synthetic delta-9 THC is treated a little bit differently because it gets classified as a synthetic phytocannabinoid instead of as a synthetic cannabinoid. So these drugs are basically just synthetic analogs to delta-9 THC. They're very, very similar in structure to natural delta-9 THC. You still get some of the issues that come along with synthetic drugs compared to natural drugs, but under a microscope, they are more or less similar to delta-9 THC. The problem more arises with the offshoots that started to stray away from the safety profile of delta-9 THC naturally. I know that the early synthetic cannabinoids weren't any more potent than natural THC concentrate oil. But very shortly, synthetic cannabinoids would reach a profile which would make them far, far more potent than the standard delta-9 mimicking synthetic cannabinoids. So, for a moment, let's talk about John William Huffman, because he's a very important figure in this story. Also, may he rest in peace. He was the first person to synthesize novel synthetic cannabinoids. So, synthetic cannabinoids, drugs that could trigger the CB1, CB2 receptors without trying to directly mimic the structure of delta-9 THC. This man is a legend and never signed up for it. The man probably thought I was an idiot for ever having used any of his molecules. In fact, I quote, "We had no idea that anyone would be stupid enough to use it. If you want to get high, marijuana is easily available. These things are dangerous. Anybody who uses them is playing Russian roulette," Huffman said. "They have a profound psychological effects. We never intended them for human consumption." So, this was just your salt-of-the-earth organic chemistry professor doing science at Clemson University in South Carolina. And in 1984, he began synthesizing cannabinoid compounds for the purpose of medical and other research. Him and his team were responsible for over 400 synthetic cannabinoids, with JWH-018, his 18th experimental substance, being the star child, so to speak. It even has his name, JWH. That child would unfortunately become a problem around 20 years later. So, I've done a little bit of research into the subject, trying to find links to this on the old internet, in the archives, and I can kind of corroborate with the claim on Wikipedia about the psychedelic being one of the first groups to sell spice. Alright, so what is spice? So in roughly 2004 to 2006, there were a couple of companies in Europe that realized that, hey, John William Huffman published all of his journals on his work, because that's what scientists do. They want other scientists to learn from what they have done, from the resources that they have poured into the subjects that they focus on. It's kind of a faux pas to study something and keep results for yourself. That doesn't really mesh with the idea of the scientific process. Naturally, John, we'll just refer to him as JWH for now, for simplicity's sake, or Professor Huffman, I guess is the more appropriate way to refer to him. So Professor Huffman pondered it for a while, because, he knew that people would eventually find his work and find his research and say, hey, I can make some money off of this. And he worried about that. But, again, scientists do what scientists do, and they publish their works that others can learn from it. And he decided to publish his work on synthetic cannabinoids, which anyone who has a basic undergraduate degree in organic chemistry Hell, someone even just taking organic chemistry could probably have enough information at hand to be able to synthesize JWH-018 if they know how to source the proper chemicals to make it. And, even in the early 2000s, there were plenty of online commerce options for getting Chinese chemicals custom made for whatever you want. These drugs weren't scheduled, there was nothing illegal, this was just completely above the board chemistry at the time. So, begrudgingly, Professor Huffman published his work online. And it took a while, but some unscrupulous chemists discovered the synthesis routes for some of his compounds, and it didn't take too long for Chinese chemists, potentially, maybe even clandestine European chemists, to start taking a crack at it. From the reports and everything, it seems that it started with JW8018. There were a few other spice compounds that were found with other cannabinoids, but the most common chemical behind spice was going to be JW8018. I'm sorry, I may have got distracted a little bit there, but I didn't describe what spice actually is. So, we have these compounds that get produced and are formed in a mostly hydrochloride salt or an oil form. These chemicals are very, very potent. So what people learned that they could do is, in order to mimic marijuana, they could take dried herbs such as marshmallow leaf, damiana, wild daga, and combine them, dried out. You could buy these in bulk for super cheap online or in herbal stores. And they would take the chemical, dilute it down in acetone, and then from there, they would spray it onto the inert dried herb. This naturally created a product that was wildly unpredictable. It would be then consumed by its users by smoking in the same way that marijuana would be in joints or in pipes or bongs or what have you. Some people reported about using dry herb vaporizers for it, but considering the heat that's required for vaporization for most of these chemicals, I think that was more or less a placebo from these users in these old forums. But yeah, if you put this into a joint and smoked it, you would get really high, and it was legal. It was sold in smoke shops, head shops, anywhere you would find any other sketchy substance, gas station boner pills and the like, weird legal highs that you would find in Europe, just all of these things. Smoke shops that would sell marijuana paraphernalia, they would have spice. Now, we call it spice because the psychedelic was one of the first groups to start producing it on a commercial scale, and they marketed it in the UK, in the city of London, as spice. In 2006 is about the earliest that I can confirm that spice was being sold by the psychedelic. There was a law that actually changed around 2005. I may have my dates wrong on that. I'm sorry, I haven't written an actual script. I'm just trying to go off of memory for this here. There was a law in the UK that made it, until 2005, psilocybin mushrooms were completely unregulated, and you could just buy those. And they were sold in a similar way to spice in head shops and whatnot. And that was the psychedelic's purpose, starting as a company in 2004, was to sell magic mushrooms to people. But with this new law coming in, they had to find a new way to gain money for their venture. Otherwise, what's the point? And so, somehow one of them discovered this obscure chemical made by a professor in Clemson, South Carolina, and said, hey, sounds like that will produce effects in humans closely related to marijuana. Let's sell legal weed. And this was still a time of deep prohibition, even in places that were more progressive and liberal, such as Europe. Marijuana still not looked very highly upon in the UK at the time and get you very serious jail time. But now we have this chemical with very little time on the radar of anyone, apart from the chemists that were working on it in Clemson University, that can get you high in the same way that Delta-9 THC can, without any of the risk, with very minimal cost. You have to think about this. The first few chemists, the Chinese chemists making this, were selling it for pennies on the kilo, basically. And 1 kilo of JWH018 is enough to make thousands upon thousands of doses. It's way, way more cost efficient than most other of your standard pharmacopoeia of drugs. Like, you can only make a gram of cocaine go very far, but a gram of JWH018 goes a very, very long way. So, you've got this cheap chemical, you've got a cheap process of making it into a drug, and it's legal. You can sell it. People will buy it. People will buy it just as easy as they can go out and buy alcohol. Even easier because there were no regulations, which meant that there was no one having to card for said substances. So what's the catch? As I have hinted at previously, this is not all sunshine and rainbows. This isn't some wonder drug. That's just a chemically similar drug to THC without any of the risk, because that would be too easy. Instead, what we have is, well, okay. JWH018 was a relatively safe chemical. In the long run of things, compared to what would come afterwards, JWH018 was less impactful. It was a full antagonist. Alright, so the problem here arises in the term antagonism. So, cannabis, delta-9 THC cannabis, is a partial antagonist of the CB1, CB2 receptors. This is good, because there's a ceiling that you reach when you're intoxicated from it, where you can only get so much of it in your system doing its thing at a time. Overdose is essentially impossible. Now, you may get too high and have a panic attack. That can happen. That happens a lot. That's pretty fucking common, actually. But, you're not gonna die. No one ever has. I know there's some fear-mongering, and I may be accused of disinformation or whatever, but no one's ever died from smoking weed. Not from it alone. Now, maybe there's some comorbidities that can happen. If you're already prone to mental illness, it can bring out latent psychosis, which can lead to things such as suicides and violence and psychotic breaks and just all kinds of nastiness. This is not super common, but it can happen. Any altering substance can really do this. I believe that alcohol could even influence some of these things, can even bring about some of these latent issues. Now, that's besides the point. Cannabis is a partial agonist. It can only do so much to work on your CB1, CB2 receptors. The problem arose in that some of these novel synthetic compounds were full antagonists, so they don't have a limit. There is no ceiling. They can keep stimulating and exciting your CB1 and CB2 receptors to the point where it causes severe issues. And the severe issues would be agitation, psychoses, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure. Risk of seizure would become super, super big, and this would be a compounding issue later in the further generations of synthetic compounds. It would cause hallucinations in a way that synthetic or standard cannabinoids would not cause. It would cause blood loss issues. There were issues multiple times with blood thinners being associated with synthetic cannabinoids. And even still, dose-dependent would be an issue because the way they were spraying spice, just this inert chemical, or this inert herbal substance with this chemical, it would create what's known as hotspots because they're not properly dosing out the chemical into the flower. Now, they may have properly dosed the amount of chemical in the acetone, but if they are not actually mixing properly, then, they're just letting the droplets with the active chemical fall where they may with whatever amount of substance they may. And maybe the number's done wrong. Maybe they missed a decimal point and put, 2 grams instead of 0.2 grams into the mixture, which creates a you can have a substance that has been turned 10, 100, 1,000 times fold more potent than it's meant to be by simple human error. there's a lot that can go wrong. I mean, these were also substances that were completely human untested, so we only know the dosage because of people willing to be guinea pigs and try it out and report favorable doses. It was trial and error, every single thing. Even batch from batch of spice could be different. You know, you'd have a bag of spice that you bought one day at a smoke shop, and the bag that they got in the shipment overnight that you get the next day could be 10 times more potent, and you wouldn't know. There's no way to know. It's unregulated. There's no dosage information on the packaging. I say this because these would be issues that would become more apparent down the line. We're still in the good part of the spice business for now. If that's in the early 2000s, it was just, you know, some psychonauts in Europe that were wanting to expand their consciousness, embarking on using this drug. That's fine. I mean, willing adults wanting to experiment with their mental state is, in my opinion, perfectly healthy and normal. As long as there's no risk of death or, you know, societal harm, then there's really not much fault in that at all, in my opinion. The problem arises pretty quickly. So, you know, the same things I was warning about with standard cannabinoids, such as the risk of psychotic break and, you know, suicidality, violence, that sort of thing. Same thing applies to synthetic cannabinoids. Same thing applies to JW8018. And there were a few notable cases of people doing synthetic cannabinoids from the first generation of spices that would end up going and ending their lives. There was a kid in USA that was very notable for doing just that before 2010. I actually believe it may have been in 2010. I don't remember his name, I don't remember the exact date, but that was what spurred the impetus for the United States to put a ban on JW8018. Europe also put a ban on JW8018, recognizing it in 2008. German authorities seized substances that were being shipped that contained JW8018, probably spice, probably some off-brand company of other than Psychedelic that was trying to sell spice. Notably, from what I can tell, the Psychedelic went out of business in 2006. So they were only selling spice for maybe a few months. I can't find any reports of the Psychedelic operating past 2008 at all, like in any capacity. But from everything I'm seeing is that they had about a year, maybe most at max, of selling spice before it was just over. And by that point, cat's out of the bag. Everyone knows about the secret of making this false marijuana, this fake weed that would later be a term coined in the news for it. And it's over. Now people know they can make so much money by selling this stuff. And they did. Alright, so you've got all these companies already figuring out the thing about JW8018. By 2008, it was found in America. There was some seized shipments of spices that were found by the DEA crossing customs into America containing JW8018. So by that point, it had already been sold in America for maybe a year without being detected. There's some forum reportings from people saying that they used it before 2008 in the USA. Now, I can say that I have found videos of Europeans using spice before 2008, so I can confirm that. But I've never seen a video of an American using spice or a synthetic cannabinoid product before 2008. So we'll just have to go on the quoted news sources and whatnot that I was able to discover talking about this, that 2008 is about the time that spice use started in America. Before that, you had about 4 years of it in Europe, which, without a lot of fanfare, really. It's maybe the first couple of people that were, or not the first couple, but like the first wave of people using spice products were more responsible with it. Maybe it's just a numbers game, I don't know. It did increase in popularity, and when it hit the scene, it kind of had like a wave. Because you gotta think about it. This is a drug that perfectly mimics marijuana. Easy to make, easy to access, doesn't show up on drug tests. that's a real kicker, because anyone on probation, anyone with a government job, anyone in drug court, anyone having to deal with any sort of thing that would require a random drug test could still get high without having to worry about that. This appealed to workers, this applied to sports athletes, this applied to officials, anyone could use this. Teenagers could get hold of this really easily, so it was a very tempting thing for that, since, you didn't have to go to like a sketchy dude and have to sit in his basement and listen to him talk about Pearl Jam and play Madden with him for 2 hours before you got your fucking 20 sack of weed that was taxed, and he made you smoke the bowl with him out of your sack of weed that you were buying from him while you were playing Madden with him and talking about fucking Pearl Jam for 2 hours. That didn't happen to me. That's just how it was back in the day. So like, you just go to a gas station and say, hey, I would like a bag of Spice Gold, and you pay $30 for it, and you get an eighth of Spice Gold. Pretty cool. So 2008 starts to get noticed in America, and by 2010 there were already laws being put in place to outlaw JW8018 and other synthetic cannabinoids that were discovered at the time. Oh yeah, keep in mind, Professor Huffman synthesized over 400 synthetic cannabinoids, so that list of drugs is going to come up. And it wasn't just him. Pfizer and a chemist in Israel was also working on synthetic cannabinoids. Those will also come up in the further waves of synthetic cannabinoids and spices. So the US starts to take moves to outlaw spice. But the problem with this is that since there's so many different types of drugs in this category, it was like playing whack-a-mole, where, you could ban one drug, you could ban JW8018, but Professor Huffman made 400 of those things, so there's more that can replace it. So the first wave of synthetic cannabinoids were mostly harmless. There wasn't a lot of deaths that came from it. Now, there were some people that died. It's not entirely harmless, but, for the drugs that we would see pop up in the future in terms of research chemicals, they really weren't that bad. I'm biased, I can admit that. But yeah, this was a drug that really closely mimicked the profile of standard cannabis, which is honestly not a very destructive or dangerous substance. The second generation of synthetic cannabinoids was a completely different story. So, one of the poster childs of the second wave of synthetic cannabinoids was AM2201, which it's when we started to see these synthetic cannabinoids really become openly available and more potent than standard cannabis by times of 10 to 30 times more potent, up to hundreds of times more potent. And it showed in the effects on people. This is when casual users that weren't ready for, hadn't used a lot of drugs, weren't ready for these sort of experiences, had full-blown, comparable to psychedelic experiences. They were thrust into psychosis, having hallucinations, having their body heat up, having temperature regulation issues, having their heartbeat raise, having, these invasive thoughts, having, a disassociation from their own body. It's terrifying. And if you weren't ready for this, this person may lash out violently or unexpectedly. And so this happened, and this happened a lot. And that problem with the seizure-inducing nature of this chemical became more apparent, because people would use this once and just have a seizure, and multiple seizures. Strokes would happen. You would have a perfectly normal, healthy 17-year-old use a bag of, so spice is no longer around, but that's still a catch-all term for it. But by this point, one of the brands that in America that it was known as K2. And this is one of the earlier brands that was mostly JW8018. Would eventually get replaced and made by different companies and be different substances, but started as JW8018. And so K2 was what most Americans would be calling it. So, and then after that, in the second wave, you would have a proliferation of brands, and anyone who could was making this product, and multiple people were counterfeiting one another. So the K2 at this time wasn't even made by the same company that made the K2 that it contained JW018. So there were brands that would pop up, such as like Diablo or Head Trip or Dead Man Walking, or I believe that this time is when we started to see the Joker brands. You would see Caution as a brand, so it'd be Caution Blue, Caution Platinum. You would see some more experimentals. I remember a brand, I actually have a sticker for this still. It's one of the few things from my Spice times that I held on to during recovery for some reason. But there's a sticker attached to my base for a brand of Spice called Dark Knight 2. I never tried Dark Knight 1, but I found the Dark Knight 2. And there would be this imagery on these foil baggies, these Mylar baggies, full of this green herby substance that would have this like horror imagery, would evoke these images of terror. And it's strange, but it also does make sense considering the chemicals that were inside of them, because it's so easy for these hyperactive cannabinoid 1 or CB1 and CB2 receptor engaging drugs to agitate a person and just completely bring them into a mess, make them, something out of this world. They don't even understand the experiences that they were having, something that people saw as being demonic. And it's not just synthetic cannabinoids that around this time was causing the issue. By now, there were other research chemicals that were hitting the mass market, most notably bath salts. In 2012, there was a man in Florida that was attacked by another man and had part of his face removed. And the man that did that attack was murdered by police in the process. But in his system, all they found was THC. Now, I believe that even though it was blamed on bath salts at the time, I believe that synthetic cannabinoids may have been part of the factor here, because those could sometimes still show up as THC in drug tests occasionally, depending on the substance. Alright, so you've got a more dangerous wave of synthetic cannabinoids coming through. And so that means naturally you're going to have laws coming out to ban them. And in 2011, there were laws put into place that were meant to ban synthetic cannabinoids. But again, they only banned specific substances, which didn't really stem the root problem. The Chinese chemical producers were just going to find another one, change the chemical a little bit, add something to the carbon molecule, or add something to the carbon chain, and bing, bang, boom, you've got a completely new synthetic cannabinoid with wildly unpredictable effects. So, this drug started as a mild THC-like substance, named in reference to the Frank Herbert novel Dune and the spice substance in there, became this money-making substance. Like, people could cheaply produce this and produce it in a large scale, and damage be damned, they were going to sell it. They were going to sell it to whoever they could. So 2012, we've got still firmly in the second wave of synthetic cannabinoids, because the laws put in place in 2011 didn't really go into place until the end of 2012. So there were some temporary bannings by the DEA, temporary scheduling, I should say, that would lead into full-blown bans later down the line. But for now, things were relatively calm. So let me talk about my personal experiences here with synthetic cannabinoids a little bit. I'm going to try to avoid going into too many personal details while still telling something that's detailed and personally intimate about myself. So 2012, early 2012 is when I first started using synthetic cannabinoids. I was young, let's just say it that, too young to be using these, considering the effects that they can have on developing minds. I was young, but I still was early enough to use starting at the second wave of synthetic cannabinoids. what struck me at first was how different this experience was. Weed had this stigma because even though I loved cannabis by this point, it's smelly, it's burdensome. You had to go through all these hoops to acquire it in a legal process, or in an illegal process, and there was danger associated with that, whereas spice popped up and smoke shops were selling it. I could just go get a Mylar packet of some green herb and then be able to smoke it, and I would get high, and it was great. But the thing about it that was most appealing was the fact that it got me higher than cannabis could. Significantly higher. Like, psychedelically higher. Like, again, with the hallucinations, for me, a lot of times, with dose controlling and using it, it was a very good experience. Now, I think the problem arises mostly in how much people would use. People would think that you would need to use a similar amount that you would use with cannabis, but with the potency of these drugs, that was a folly. So just like the smallest amount of this chemical or this herbal substrate would need to be used to get intoxicated rather than a larger amount like with standard cannabis. So provided that you were metering your use, it could be a good time. Now, there would still be the regulation errors and the hotspots I talked about that could be an issue, but even still, if you're regulating your use and you hit a hotspot, it's not as bad as if you smoked an entire joint or blunt of this substance and then hit a hotspot. So, smoke shops were selling these. I believe it was an openly known secret with police and law enforcement at the time, and I don't think they did a whole lot about it in the area that I was living in with it. People were definitely driving while intoxicated on this. Children were getting a hold of it. It was doing untold damage to the community. Like, it's because people would have to be admitted and hospitalized at a far greater rate for synthetic cannabinoids than they would for standard cannabis. It wasn't just your basic panic attacks because someone got too high from eating a brownie or two. It was naked dude with a knife running around thinking that demons are gonna eat him, like that sort of shit. So, smoke shops are selling it cheaply and everywhere. Gas stations are selling it. Anywhere that was willing to proliferate from it was going to be selling it, which made it super accessible, which was good for me being an addict at the time. Which, here's the other insidious thing, is that cannabis isn't physically addictive. It's mentally addictive. You'll get hooked on it, but it's not like, it doesn't interfere with your body so much when you come off of it. You don't go through an actual physical withdrawal in the same way that you do with synthetic cannabinoids. With synthetic cannabinoids, you sure do. It's bad. Now, I myself have never been an opioid user, so I can't speak exactly what the exact process of opioid withdrawal is like, but having experienced synthetic cannabinoid withdrawal, I would assume that is a very, very similar process, because everything I've read about opioid withdrawal, synthetic cannabinoid withdrawal fit the bill. And it occurs within just a week of active use of synthetic cannabinoids can produce these withdrawal symptoms. And so, when you abstain from synthetic cannabinoids after having used for a while, within, a few hours, you'll start to feel anxious and sick to your stomach and sweaty and just bad, like an impending sense of doom. And for 2 weeks, it'll fuck your sleep. You'll be waking up every 15 minutes thinking that you need more of the substance to be able to sleep, but you don't have it, you're not taking it, so you can't have it anymore. You'll throw up when you try to eat because your body can't regulate properly without the spice, you have no appetite. You'll feel cold, you'll feel hot, you'll sweat, you'll be feverish, you'll potentially hallucinate, you'll be in a weird disassociated state to where you don't even recognize other people or yourself. It's a really bad time. It's not good, and it takes multiple weeks for you to get back to a baseline where you're feeling even somewhat normal. Cannabis doesn't do this. Synthetic cannabinoids do. So I assume there's some mythical being out there that has the willpower to use synthetic cannabinoids sparingly enough to not get physically addicted to them, to be able to avoid the dangers of the random dosing of it. Maybe avoid spice altogether and just use the chemical with an actual volumetric dosing properly done. you could potentially use synthetic cannabinoids safely, but the fact of the matter was, most people weren't doing that. Humans are lazy. We'd just rather buy the packet of spice from the gas station, and that's it. You're done. It was easy, and, these drugs were packaged in these brightly colored packagings with cartoon characters, and it's hard not to see how this stuff was targeted towards children. And that's something that's used in fear-mongering and think of the children, but fucking Scooby Snacks. I'll have a picture of Scooby Snacks here on the screen real quick just so you can understand how blatant this shit was sometimes. They were definitely targeting children. Yeah, they were definitely targeting the uneducated. They were targeting the poor, the vulnerable. And that's what makes it most insidious, is that even though this drug at times would be good, would be a pleasurable substance, the downsides would hurt the people that it appealed to the most. And someone with access to resources wouldn't have to worry so much about the physical withdrawal because they would have access to rehab facilities. They would have people who know and are experienced with opioid withdrawal that would be able to help someone experiencing similar symptoms to opioid withdrawal. Someone who's poor going through synthetic cannabinoid withdrawal just has to fucking deal with it. It's not a good time. I've spent maybe a few months of my total life withdrawing from synthetic cannabinoids, be it voluntarily or not, because I just didn't have enough money to buy more, so I would get sick from not having the drug. And eventually culminating to the time when I decided in 2017 that I would stop using altogether. I've been sober since then. I have not used a synthetic cannabinoid since 2017. I withdrawed that one last time and was done. It's good because it's mostly an extinct class of it's mostly an extinct class of drug at this point in time. In 2020, when COVID lockdowns in China happened, people who were making synthetic cannabinoids stopped. And the people who were using synthetic cannabinoids, mostly in America, they also stopped. And they replaced it with other drugs like fentanyl and xylazine, which that might be another video down the line at some point. But it's already bad enough. I don't want to talk about those sort of substances. I'm already talking about synthetic cannabinoids. People have likened this rise of research chemicals and synthetic drugs as a form of a second opium war, like a revenge back on us for what we did to their populace way back when. Alright, so since this is the first time I'm talking about this, I'm gonna try and cut it short here, because I feel like I'm just rambling a little bit at this point, which is fine. For a initial trial episode, it is good to just kind of get my thoughts out, but I would like this to be something of a series, and I'd be able to go a little bit more in depth with this substance. But I want to say that even though it is mostly extinct, this is still a problem in communities and does pop up from time to time. And the synthetic cannabinoids that exist nowadays are super dangerous and crazy for what they can do to you. So if you are considering using a synthetic cannabinoid, please don't. Weed is available. Most states are legal in this way, and even if it's not, you can get Delta 8, you can get THCA. There are other options that won't cause physical withdrawal, that won't cause these psychotic symptoms, that can still get you higher than standard Delta 9 THC. So even that's not something you need to use as an excuse to use synthetic cannabinoids. If you are actively addicted to synthetic cannabinoids right now, please get help. Stop using them. Seek treatment if you can't have the availability. If not, find a loved one, confide in them, get the resources you need to survive the 2 weeks, and do that. It's better to stop now, because every time you use, there's a risk of these seizures, of strokes, of dangers to your heart, of, coma, of death, and we need you here, so don't die because of some shitty class of drug that shouldn't exist in the first place. Only exists because of drug prohibition against Delta 9 THC. Don't. It's difficult. I did it. I've survived. I believe that you can too. You may need help. I needed help, but I got through it almost entirely without... I had friends to help. I didn't have systems to help. And if it wasn't for friends to help, I probably wouldn't have survived that. I would have eventually died from using this drug. Wow, I was expecting to maybe be a little bit biased too much towards the side of the drug, but I think I did a good job of explaining the harms that can come of using spice. Don't. So I'm going to be talking about this more in the future. I just wanted a preliminary just to kind of like lay the groundwork and explain more or less like what I thought about this and maybe gauge and see if there's any interest. It's just I saw one of the AI slop videos talking about synthetic cannabinoids and I'm really angry because there's just a lot of misinformation in there and they don't really understand why that these things were sold. And I would like to eventually be able to kind of cover the hows and the whys completely and more in depth of where we got to point A to point B on that. So yeah, thanks for listening to me ramble. I appreciate it. Good night.